Welcome. I'm Glen Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. Throughout our nation's history, we've had occasional wars and then we've demobilized afterward. But after World War II, we launched the Cold War and we maintained a permanent war status. We also created a permanent war economy. Massive military spending year after year, decade after decade, since the 1940s, has distorted and disrupted the U.S. economy and has also hurt our society in many ways. This is the topic of tonight's TV program. Every year, Congress makes decisions about how to spend how much money for which purposes. For example, Congress could choose to spend less for nuclear weapons and more for education. But beyond such budgetary trade-offs, military spending causes problems in the system of our economy, systemic harm of how our economy functions, and systemic harm to our society as a whole. It is possible to convert from a war economy to a peace economy. This economic conversion would produce positive ripple effects throughout our economy and throughout our whole society. If we want to rescue our economy and our society from continuing decline, we must convert to a peace economy. In 1976 and 77, I conducted a lot of research on this and discovered that economists and other researchers had proven that military spending causes systemic problems in our economy. I produced this 100-page report, which is the basis for this TV program, and had the occasion to look at it again just a few months ago and saw that the economic realities were still valid, but the problems had continued on their trajectory of worse and worse damage to the economy because of our excessive military spending. The report looked at the problems, also looked at how to convert to a peaceful economy, including the economy in Washington State. Other people in Washington State and around the country were thinking along similar lines and were doing research and organizing. In about 1980, I worked with some other people to help create the Washington State Conversion Project, and I also helped to draft some legislation that would move the state along toward converting our state's economy, and I testified at legislative hearings on the bills. But in the early 80s, when Ronald Reagan launched his massive escalation of military spending, the pressure just extinguished and overwhelmed the likelihood of converting to a peace economy, and the movement for peace conversion withered. Now our economy is crumbling. We're decades further down the trajectory of economic decline, and we have to look again at converting to a peace economy as one remedy for all the things that ail our economy. These different economic factors are interrelated, and military spending is crucial for a number of them. I read my 1977 report again, as I mentioned, and found that it would be a good topic for this TV program to consider. So what I want to do is summarize it, read a number of the quotations from a number of economists and governmental officials and others, and show some of the things that people have been doing along the way of researching and organizing. Most of this information was, again, decades old. There just has not been attention to this lately, but I certainly hope there would be. For example, Hoops and Scoville produced a much respected report for the Council on National Priorities and Resources about military policy and budget priorities for 1979 to 82. This is looking at the military budget in thoughtful ways and also looking at possible conversion. this is the women's budget, is looking at the military budget from the perspective of what women actually needed from our economy. This is the costs and consequences of Reagan's military budget. This was put out by the Coalition for New Foreign and Military Policies and the Council on Economic Priorities. This was produced during the time of the Freeze campaign in the early 80s, looking at the economic implications. So you can see a lot was done, but some decades ago, and we need to get back into this. Arthur Burns, who was the chair of the Federal Reserve several decades ago, wrote, "The economic growth of a nation is a blind concept unless we consider what is produced as well as the rate of growth of what happens to be produced." And during this program here, I'll explain a couple of points here. One is that over-dependence on military spending hurts our economy. Two, peace conversion would be desirable from economic reasons as well as the more obvious moral considerations. Three, peace conversion would be possible if it were more fully understood and more ambitiously promoted. And four, even areas such as Washington State that are heavily dependent on the military spending would benefit a lot from peace conversion. The report that I'll be drawing from for this program is divided into four main sections. In part one, we explore the Pentagon as the preeminent example of what economist John Kenneth Galbraith has termed the planning system. Part two covers the national impact of military spending and the potential for peace conversion. Part three covers local impacts. Part four explores the process of peace conversion and suggests some directions to move toward. This is a quotation from the magazine U.S. News and World Report from May 14, 1950. Government planners figure they have found the magic formula for almost endless good times. They're now beginning to wonder if there may not be something to perpetual motion after all. Cold War is the catalyst. Cold War is an automatic pump primer. Turn a spigot and the public clamors for more arms spending. Turn another, the clamor ceases. Truman confidence, cockiness is based on this Truman formula. The Truman era of good times, the president is told, can run much beyond 1952. Cold War demands, if fully exploited, are almost limitless. And after that cheery note, 2 months later, the Korean War came along. A federal employee who was responsible for managing finances at the Pentagon, A. Ernest Fitzgerald, whom we'll quote and discuss during this program, said, "One of my close friends was employed in a helicopter plant at the time of the invasion of Cambodia in 1970. He reported that some workers in the plant openly cheered the news of helicopter losses in that action. Their work was running low and the anticipated replenishment orders assured continued employment at familiar tasks for them." And here's a quotation. All of these quotations are decades old. U.S. Marine Corps retired Colonel James A. Donovan said, "War has become the nation's leading industry." So these quotations show we really have to look at this a lot. President Eisenhower understood something of the logic of this report when he said, "Every addition to defense expenditures does not automatically increase military security, because security is based upon moral and economic as well as purely military strength. A point can be reached at which additional funds for arms, far from bolstering security, weaken it." One of the biggest industries in the world is military weaponry. And the United States is the main weapons manufacturer and the main arms dealer to the world. The United States spends as much on our military as all of the other 190 plus countries put together. And we outspend the others in terms of military weapons sales to other countries. And so we hook them into the weapons addiction as well. Even in the early 1960s, civilian employees for the Department of Defense constituted about 40% of all federal employees. There was a study decades ago, again, saying that about 20% of the jobs in the United States, either directly or indirectly related to the Department of Defense. About half of the scientists and engineers in private industry worked for aerospace and military fields a few decades ago. The National Science Foundation and the Bureau of the Budget calculated that during the mid-1960s, 2/3 of all the research and development work in the entire nation was financed by the Department of Defense, NASA, and the Atomic Energy Commission. The Department of Defense owns a tremendous amount of property all over this country and in other countries as well. And so the amount of economic impact that the Pentagon has over us, over producers, over employees, research and development, property, as well as just the sheer size of the military budget, gives the Pentagon an enormous and incredible amount of economic power and hence political power. Anybody with that amount of money can call the shots about what goes on in the country. The famous economist John Kenneth Galbraith referred to the Pentagon as the preeminent example of what he called the planning system, which we'll talk about. He says the Pentagon does not really provide true national security, but rather acts in order to aggrandize and solidify its own power base. And it doesn't really care about efficiency. The important thing is economic and political domination. One simple, straightforward reason to reduce military spending considerably is that so much of it is just waste. We're not getting anywhere near our money's worth. And A. Ernest Fitzgerald, whom I quoted earlier in the program, who was Deputy for Management Systems in the Air Force headquarters in the Pentagon, gradually discovered that, quote, waste was the Pentagon's policy, unquote. He wrote a fascinating book called The High Priests of Waste, in which he describes with fastidious detail and accuracy how wastefulness is institutionalized in the Pentagon and its corporate suppliers. And he didn't want to have to believe it, but there was just so much compelling evidence that it finally forced him to confront that reality. As a clincher, Fitzgerald, whose job it was to monitor expenditures, discovered and revealed that Lockheed had cheated the Pentagon, which means the taxpayers, out of a $2 billion cost overrun on the C-5A military transport plane, and the Pentagon fired him for doing his job in exposing that example of waste. People will often support military spending because they say, well, it creates jobs. But actually, military spending is a very expensive and inefficient program. The same amount of money, according to study after study after study, the same amount of money would create a lot more jobs if it was put into almost any other kind of spending. You put it into schools, you put it into healthcare, you put it into alternative energy, almost anything, you would create more jobs than putting it into militarism. The weapons are so high-tech and so expensive, even decades ago, that you don't get as many jobs out of it as you would if you put the money into other programs. Richard J. Barnett, who's done excellent research on this, points to two of the most objectionable characteristics of the industry's role in the military spending process. He says, and this is quotations from him, the first is that a relatively few firms derive unfair economic advantages from what amounts to a public franchise. Such firms, which play so vital a role in setting national priorities, are public in every sense but one. They pocket substantial private profits, but they're wholly unaccountable to the taxpayers who finance their operations. The second objectionable feature, he says, is that the dependence of the defense industry on the Pentagon gives the military immense added power. The Pentagon's ability to control a major share of the nation's industrial production gives the Department of Defense a commanding position in the economy, which carries with it a dangerous concentration of political power. So the Department of Defense huge budget gives it unequaled decision power over manpower, materials, and industrial production capacity in the United States and around the world. And this is according to Seymour Melman, who's one of the best researchers on this. He's an engineer by trade, but he's done just massive amounts of research over quite a number of years about military spending and what it does to the U.S. economy and our industrial sector. And he says the Pentagon is able to, quote, outbid other industries and other organizations, including other agencies of the federal and other governments, unquote. In another book, Mellman concludes, quote, the government of the United States now includes a self-expanding war machine that uses military power for diverse political operations and is based upon an industrial management that has priority claims to virtually unlimited capital funds from the federal budget. The state management is economically parasitic, hence exploitative, in its relation to American society at home. To the older pattern of exploitative imperialism abroad, there is now added an institutional network that is parasitic at home. This combination is the new imperialism. The American business community at the very macro level has enjoyed a very cozy and uncritical relationship with the Pentagon. Some decades ago, the United States Chamber of Commerce had a national committee that reviewed budgets of various governmental departments. But even though more than half of the federal administrative budgets go to the Pentagon's budget is excluded from the National Chamber of Commerce's evaluation. It's a sacred cow whose expenditures are beyond the realm of even review, let alone criticism. In the late 1950s, when news of increasing international tension would come along, the stock market would go up. And as news of easing tensions came along, that caused the stock markets to decline. The stock markets were perceiving that what was good for war was going to be good for capitalism. That's a dangerous connection to make. During the late 1960s, the notion that peace was the enemy of prosperity was often expressed among those who earned their livelihood from the war in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. And in some of the military weapons plants on the West Coast, some of the workers wore a little lapel pin that said, "Don't bite the war that feeds you." So here's something else from Seymour Mellman. He says, quote, the military industrial firms and the state management that directs them have avoided or opposed steps to prepare for a peace economy, apparently on the assumption that to do so would remove a major justification for the continued high level of military budgets, unquote. In 1964, U.S. Senator George McGovern and 30 other members of the Senate, as well as some House members, introduced legislation to create a National Economic Conversion Commission, which would study and plan for converting the economy from military to civilian production. President Johnson and some senior Pentagon officers exerted heavy pressure, and they killed that legislation. Other efforts along that line have also been squashed. And this was back in the 60s. You can imagine how unlikely it would be to find that kind of support for peace in the Senate nowadays. There's another obstacle to this economic conversion, and that's just the perception that spending all that money for war is free enterprise. It's business. But if you see smaller amounts being devoted to things like housing or food safety or something, they call that socialism. And so there's that double standard that pertains. There's this famous quotation in President Eisenhower's final address as president, and he said, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." Okay, let's look at some more at how the Pentagon functions here. I mentioned Arthur Burns, who used to be the head of the Federal Reserve, and he lamented the fact that for military contractors, skill in negotiating with government officials, or simply just knowing the right people or having friends in the right places, was becoming more important than skill and knowledge in cost control or marketing or any kind of good business skills. Robert McNamara was appointed to be Secretary of Defense when President Kennedy took office in '61, and McNamara was respected as being like a a clear-thinking, cost-benefit analysis kind of guy who would really make sure that we got every nickel's worth of benefit. But he never challenged the nuclear overkill that gave us the equivalent of several tons of TNT, of nuclear destructive power for every person. That was just beyond the scope of what he could imagine, even when he was doing other work for cost-benefit analysis. There's a tendency for people in the House and people in the Pentagon to try to curry favor with folks all around the country to support weapon systems that don't have any real justification on military grounds. There's a point here that our military expenditures abroad have been a main feature in the balance of payment deficits. And again, this is coming from this report I put together that was several decades ago, and that has continued worse and worse as the U.S. balance of payment deficits to other countries has gotten worse. And we have this extensive spending of U.S. tax dollars in other countries, and we aren't getting money sent back to us in the form of buying our products. And in order to recoup some of the money, the Pentagon has then resorted to strong-arming other countries to compel them to buy a U.S. weapons system, and that's how we've been generating some revenue regarding other nations, but that only makes the violence in other countries even worse. If we want to get out of this quagmire, we have to figure out, with some fresh thinking, what's the purpose of a national economy. The Norwegian Academy of Sciences studied more than 1,600 competitive arms races that occurred over the last 2,500 years. All but 16 of those 1,600 arms races ended in war. The remaining 16 ended in economic collapse for the competing countries. One of the rationalizations for military spending has been that with the arms race, we could spin the Russians into bankruptcy. And again, I wrote this report in '77, but we were spinning ourselves into bankruptcy at the same time. The Soviet Union crashed first, but the United States is in the process of crashing now. It's important when we consider the impact of military spending to consider not just like jobs per se, but the social impact of what those jobs produce. The economy has to have some purpose besides just having an income-generating stream. Just because a business is profitable doesn't mean that it's moral. People make livings by selling illegal drugs, by doing prostitution, by various kinds of white-collar crimes, theft, all kinds of things, and they generate income, but they're not moral. So we need to look at something beyond just making money. And we need to consider the ethics and the social and economic consequences of the war industry as well. So here's another quotation from A. Ernest Fitzgerald, whom I quoted earlier. He says, "The spending for blowing holes in the ground in Asia, for overruns on flimsy C-5As, and for cutting off legs in army hospitals all adds to the gross national product, GNP, as conceived by the economists. Such spending increases something called gross aggregate demand, which in turn is said to make jobs." And Fitzgerald also said, "The very phrase makes jobs convicts the concept and shows the shockingly shallow nature of modern economic mechanics. Obviously, the nation is poorer, not richer, by the cost of waste in non-productive activities, not to mention the human loss in the warfare so highly esteemed as an economic spur. The employment generated by wasteful spending is nothing more than a restatement of the costs in different ways. Many, if not most, of our economists seem to have lost sight of the importance of products. It is only in terms of the useful products of labor, capital, and equipment, land, and natural processes that true economic output can be measured." There's this concept of opportunity cost that we want to look at, that if we don't spend the money on this, the money is available for something else. If we do spend the money on this, we have lost the opportunity to spend the money for this other purpose that may be better. Senator Richard Russell, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, again, decades ago, said, "There is something about preparing for destruction that causes men to be more careless in spending money than they would if they knew they were building for constructive purposes. Why this is, I do not know, but I've observed for over a period of almost 30 years in the Senate that there is something about buying arms with which to kill, to destroy, to wipe out cities, and to obliterate great transportation systems, which causes men not to reckon the dollar cost as close as they do when they think about proper housing and the care of the health of human beings. So not all government spending is equally productive or equally useful or equally beneficial. And perhaps the worst kind of government spending is that goes to spending for violence in the military. The war on poverty that Johnson had promoted in the 60s got squeezed out because Johnson spent the money in the war on Vietnam. Economics has often been defined as related to the allocation of scarce resources. And again, Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Arthur Burns, explained what that means in terms of military spending. He says, the resources that we devote to national defense are not available for making consumer goods or adding to the stock of industrial equipment or for public uses in the sphere of education or health or urban redevelopment. To the extent that we allocate labor, materials, and capital to national defense, we cannot satisfy our desires for other things. The civilian goods and services that are currently foregone on account of the expenditures on national defense are therefore the current real costs of the defense establishment. Seymour Millman, who was an engineer, looked at what military spending was doing to the way our economy functions and especially our industrial capacity. And this, again, was decades ago. He said, quote, the decline of the United States as an economic and industrial system is now well underway. This is a consequence of the normal operation of a 30-year military economy fashioned under government control at the side of civilian capitalism. But the self-assured operators of the military economy that burgeoned from 1950 on never reckoned with the possibility that a permanent war economy would function as a parasite, weakening the larger host economy that feeds it, unquote. Now, this was decades ago, and we've gone farther down that road, and we are more and more depleted as a nation. There's that famous quotation from President Eisenhower, who soon after taking office in 1953 said, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. So again, let's look at Mellman, who talks about how military spending has depleted the productive capacity of the United States. And this was from his book, Pentagon Capitalism, which was published in 1970. And again, a quotation. And listen well, this is amazing stuff, and it was like 40 years ago. The United States now is the scene of a drama different from that implicit in her confident ideology. A process of technical, industrial, and human deterioration has been set in motion within American society. The competence of the industrial system is being eroded at its base. Entire industries are falling into technical disrepair, and there is massive loss of productive employment because of inability to hold even domestic markets against foreign competition. Such depletion in economic life produces wide-ranging human deterioration at home. The wealthiest nation on earth has been unable to rally the resources necessary to raise 1/5 of its own people from poverty. The same basic depletion operates as an unseen hand restricting Americans' relations with the rest of the world, limiting foreign policy moves primarily to military-based initiatives. That was from 1970, and again, we are farther down that road. We could maintain the World War II level of expenditure for the few years of World War II, and we slipped away from being able to maintain it in the more recent decades. Seymour Mellman and other researchers have documented that the scale and quality of research and development is just absolutely crucial for how the economy can function. And we've been depleting our ability to do research and development for civilian purposes and for real science. And the second is the quality of physical plant, factories, equipment, machines. Those have been deteriorating as well compared to what we need and compared to other countries. The United States iron and steel industry has lagged significantly behind other nations in research and development, and even decades ago was already getting a reputation for backwardness in adopting new technology. And iron and steel, of course, are just the basics on which the industrial capacity of a country depend. And this deficiency then gets reflected in less efficient production of consumer goods and more competitive production from other countries. And so the United States then spends money to other countries to buy their stuff because they make better stuff than we do. And that throws our own people out of work. And this is largely tied to the fact that the military economy has so much money that they can bid away the cream of the crop. They can distort the economy to serve the military's needs, and the civilian economy has been starved and starved and starved for decades. And there's documentation here. By 1968, the United States industry operated the world's oldest stock of metalworking machinery. And the trains in this country are old and slow, but the trains in Japan and Europe are fast and efficient. The United States merchant fleet decades ago was 23rd in the age of vessels. And research scientists and engineers overwhelmingly were working for the military industry rather than for civilian productions. And so while research in electronics was channeled, for example, into military electronics, consumer electronic industries were depleted and suffered, and so other countries got ahead of us. And this is a result of military spending. And the same thing is true of other industries, but we don't make those connections typically. The politicians certainly don't want to make the connections. Business doesn't make the connection. They're on board with the current gravy train. So while our stock of missiles was enlarged and renewed, the railroad rolling stock deteriorated without replacement. Again, a quotation from someone. Mellman concludes after a long narrative, Mellman concludes, U.S. policy traded off renewal of the main productive assets of the economy for the operation of the military system. There was a study in 1967 by the International Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development that's based in Paris, and they found that in the United States, 63% of our scientists, engineers, and technicians were working for research and development on behalf of the military, and that vastly outnumbered the ones that were working on civilian projects. What happens to the industrial economy then also happens to the people who need industrial jobs, blue-collar jobs, and all of the other jobs that depend on a healthy civilian economy. And the ripple effects of that depletion have extended out into unemployment and poverty and deterioration of our housing and deterioration of our infrastructure and all this. An economist named Bruce Russett has done a huge amount of work on this, again, decades ago, and he showed that public expenditures for health and hospitals suffer when military spending increases, with great cutbacks in periods of heavy military need and only slow recovery thereafter. And he found that the same thing was true in the education sector. What happens with the economy is, in any given industry, they use things from some industries and they don't use things from others. So for example, aerospace would be using aluminum and electronics and so forth, and they would not be using lumber, which we produce in Washington State, or they would not be using fish, which we produce in Washington State. And so you can look at what a given, when you build a house, you need lumber, you need the plumbing equipment, the electrical stuff, you need paint, you need furniture, you need nails, and they can look at, for any given kind of economic output, you can look at what the inputs are. And these input-output studies show that the military production does not very much generate inputs from the kinds of things that Washington State produces. So people say, oh, Boeing, gets all this money, but Boeing subcontracts that out. We don't make the jet engines here. We don't make the electronics here. We don't make a lot of the systems here. They come in from other states. But if we wanted to build housing, low-income housing, the trees are grown here, and the electricians and the plumbers already live here, and we would be putting a lot more money into use in our own communities if we hired teachers who already live here, if we hired librarians who already work here, and so forth. So you can look at the inputs and the outputs of economy. And the United States, everybody says, oh yeah, we're number one in the military, but when we look at where we are on these other lists, we're way down the list on life expectancy. We're way down the list on child mortality, infant mortality. We're way down the list in what young people know about science and math and so forth. And we know these things, but we don't make the connection often that the resources have gone into the military. And the thing is, we don't get to vote on this either. I never got a chance to vote about building nuclear weapons. I never got a chance to vote on whether to go to war in Iraq or Afghanistan. Those decisions get made by people in Washington, D.C., but what do we get to vote on here? Schools, libraries. So if people feel overtaxed, they vent their frustration by voting down school levies, or they vote against libraries, because that's all we have available for us to vote on. But the big money items, the big ticket items, we don't get a chance to vote on that. So the the military creates fewer jobs per $1 billion than other kinds of spending. If we took the same amount of money, we could produce a lot more jobs for people to do energy efficiency, better insulation, put in some weather-tight windows, seal up the cracks around your doors, put up alternative energy things, work as social workers, teachers, librarians, the things that our society really needs. You would create a lot more jobs for a given amount of money. And this has been shown over and over and over again. We have a transportation problem in this country. As I mentioned before, Japan has high-speed trains, Europe has high-speed trains, and we don't. The U.S. Secretary of Commerce, again, decades ago, this was in 1965, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce was charged with implementing a high-speed transportation act that Congress had passed in 1965, but was unable to do that because we did not have available research capacity. And a year later, here's the quotation, Vietnam has affected, we were spending the money on Vietnam, Vietnam has affected the program in other ways as well. The aerospace industry, which has exhibited great interest in advanced technology and high-speed ground transportation, has found itself much more preoccupied with defense needs. This has affected the availability of research contractors and of qualified personnel for employment within the Department of Commerce. As a result, the research and development program has taken a slower pace. And in a rare move, the Secretary of Commerce had to request much less than the amount authorized for 1967 and 68, and later on it just pooped out. A very conservative Southern Senator, Ellender, pointed out in January 1967, the truth of the matter is that in many important respects, the Congress and the nation are in the hands of the military. Add to this group the Department of State, and you have a combination that calls the shots. The admirals and the generals, strongly backed by the Department of State, seem to have the ways and means of getting just about what they want, regardless of the monetary difficulties afflicting the nation. It is to the conservation of its land and water that the nation must look if we hope to remain strong and prosperous in the decades ahead. But our investment in this field will represent only a tiny portion of the huge sums to be expended by the military. Now, we don't have conservative senators talking that way anymore, but there were some talking that way, and we've quoted several thus far. In 1969, the federal government spent $450 million on chemical and biological warfare, but only $10 million on disarmament research. That was 1/45 as much. And the chemical and biological warfare figure is about twice the amount of money spent from all sources on cancer research in that year. So you look at where our priorities go, and you'll see why we still have a lot of problems. The 10-year war against smallpox, which was wiped out entirely by about 1976 worldwide. The World Health Organization spent about $250 million on it, and that's about what the military was spending at that time in about 8 hours. So that's the relative sense of trade-off. There have been all kinds of estimates and calculations about you could wipe out world hunger for what we spend on the wars here. As our balance of payments gets worse, we've got all these military bases overseas, and that was directly a cause of the balance of payment problems and the Nixon's decision to reevaluate the dollar versus gold back in August of '71. There's a quotation from Seymour Melman that says, "The collapse in the value of the dollar formally declared in August '71 was traceable to the sustained U.S. military expenditures around the world." And so let me move on. Seymour Melman said specifically, quote, "Americans will increasingly discover that conversion to a civilian economy is the indispensable requirement for industrial, technological, and human renewal of the quality of American life," unquote. So the unemployment issue has been a major concern. There has been research done on how the military spending actually costs jobs because it doesn't create as many jobs per $1 billion as other kinds. And so here's one called The Empty Pork Barrel by Marian Anderson, Unemployment and the Pentagon Budget. This is unemployment, fallout of the arms race. Again, these are all good reports. Jobs and military spending, this is looking at federal budget priorities. The B-1 bomber says labor, the B-1's first victim. Does military spending create more jobs? The impact of military spending on the machinist union. One of the biggest unions that works on military weapon systems was the International Association of Machinists. And the machinist union was working very hard for peace conversion, for cutting military spending. And they've been able to determine that this would actually give them more jobs and more stable jobs rather than the boom and bust cycle of weapon systems. So the machinist union, which relied on military spending for their jobs, actually wanted to cut military spending and work at civilian jobs using their skills. They were a big help. This was put up by the Coalition for a New Foreign and Military Policy, more jobs, and it's about conversion. There was an organization called Pacifists for Full Employment that worked on this, and this is one on jobs and energy, showing that we could substitute alternative energy in place of military spending and create more jobs and better jobs. Washington State is heavily dependent on military spending. It's been rated heavily dependent for decades, partly because it has the big military bases at Fort Lewis and McChord, and the Navy bases on Whidbey Island, and now the Trident submarine base, and before that, other Navy bases in Kitsap County, nuclear weapons plants in Tri-Cities. There's a lot of military spending in Washington State, and of course Boeing and so forth. But people in Washington State have been working to study that and look for alternatives. So I mentioned at the beginning of the program state legislation that we developed. Here it was. These are from about 1979. Choices for Puget Sound, military spending and economic health. Choices for Puget Sound. Here's the report that was done. Economic impact project of Sixth Sense, a peace group in Tacoma. There were efforts to diversify various parts of the Washington State economy. There's a big project up on Whidbey Island, and there have been other projects elsewhere, including some Boeing plants where people are looking at alternatives. As I mentioned a few minutes back, a lot of the prime contracts that come in, say, to Boeing for military weapons, get really subcontracted out of the area. And so we could convert those plants without suffering the loss of the total amount of the prime contract, because most of that money never stays here anyway. And the materials that go into a finished product of a military weapon, as I mentioned earlier, don't draw very much from things that lead to things that come from our state economy. And the aerospace industry generates less secondary and tertiary spending and hence less employment than do other industries. And I have a listing here from of various kinds of industries, and sawmills and dairy products and meat products and pulp mills and plywood and other things produce a lot of other spending and jobs, and aerospace was down at about the bottom of this list. So we have real potential to convert without as much disaster as people imagine. We're less dependent on military spending than people assume in terms of the weapons manufacturing. And the military bases could be converted too. We'll talk about that in a moment. But when the Boeing had their big Boeing bust in like 1971, the area was actually pretty resilient because the rest of our economy was pretty healthy, and we were able to absorb that and come back without as much damage as people would have assumed. When the economy is soft, things are not so good, and we've depleted our economy to such an extent during these intervening decades that it's going to be much harder to suffer any loss. But if we don't, we're heading for a crash anyway, and if we don't take care of converting to a peacetime economy now, it's going to be even harder down the road. It is possible to do this. It's possible to also convert military bases. Payne Field used to be an Air Force base. It's just south of Everett. It is now a civilian base, and it's a vibrant economy. Moses Lake had a base, that's in eastern Washington, that had a military base, and when that base shut down and it became a civilian airport, the economy of Moses Lake improved. The Department of Defense had, and probably still has, a program called the Office of Economic Adjustment, and they would help local communities plan for conversion when they were doing base shutdowns. And this was like in the early 60s. I read a book about the experience then, and what they showed was that if a community said, oh, no, please don't shut down our base, please don't shut down our base, and they just leaned on their congressperson and the base was shut down, they ended up with nothing. But if they worked as a local community to figure out, hey, this base here has resources. It's got an airstrip, it's got a port, it's got docks, it's got housing, it's got machine equipment. You could make it into a park, into a vocational school, into community colleges, all kinds of things, and light industry and other kinds of things. And the communities that took advantage of that actually ended up with stronger economies, more jobs, more stable jobs, better paying jobs than when the military was there at those bases. And that actually worked. But it has to be done at the local community level, and then the Department of Defense would help. The same kind of help could be available for communities if we were going to get smart as a nation and really try to wean ourselves away from militarism. We could have that kind of support for communities that have weapons manufacturers as well. The important thing is to get the community involved and to look at your base or your factory as a resource, and to look at the employees as resources and say, gee, these employees have these skills, what else could they be doing with those skills? And in fact, in some places, as I mentioned, the Machinists Union in this country, in Britain, the Lucas Aerospace Workers Union, Lucas is a big weapons manufacturer in Britain, the union there actually took the lead in developing a conversion plan for Lucas Aerospace in Britain, and the union worked very hard on that. So if workers and unions and local communities and businesses get involved and think about what else can we use these resources for, they can come up with some plans, and then you get a little bit of federal spending in to help make that transition, and it works very well. it would be hard to imagine Congress having enough sense to do that now, given the amount to which big corporations that are getting fat on these military contracts contribute to the campaigns. But if we're in tough times, we need to look at serious alternatives. And there are opportunities for better, healthy local economies if we can do this. There have been examples. Here's in Salina, Kansas, Wichita and Salina. Here's a news article from decades ago. Former missile silos get new lease on life. Grumman, that makes aircraft, switched to making canoes and other things with aluminum. And this article says, Grumman prepares for future. This is economic dislocation, plant closing, plant relocations, and plant conversion. This was put up by 3 unions, United Steelworkers of America, United Auto Workers, and the International Association of Machinists. They were all on board working on these things. People have been doing these things. This is creating solar jobs. Options for military workers and communities. And this was put up by a conversion project in the San Francisco Bay Area. So there's enormous potential, but it has to be done by the people involved, and look at your skills, look at your industrial capacity, look at your resources as things that could be used for better purposes, and we could improve our economy if we wanted to do that. So there are difficulties, of course. It's important to have a good economy that can help with that transition. One step toward this is to diversify rather than just make the switch, but to start a transition from military products to civilian products and so forth, and do a transition. So there's a lot more that can be done. It would be great to have people gather and do some studying and some research on this. If we want to rescue our economy and rescue our society from continuing decline, we must convert from a war economy to a peace economy. This economic conversion would produce positive ripple effects throughout our economy and really throughout the whole society. And it is possible to do this, but we have to inform ourselves and we have to organize at the grassroots and then be able to persuade the public. We want to thank the folks who've been watching, and we want to thank whatever you may do to help move this process along. And for information, you can contact 491-9093. That's in area code 360. You got to have a plan. You got to plan ahead. Don't wait for the last minute. And but it's a great way to rebuild democracy by getting people involved. So the early part of this program talked about how terribly intertwined the Pentagon is with our economy. But also paradoxically, we've been able to show that the military economy is really quite dispensable. We would be better off without it. We would be better off with a vibrant civilian economy that produced more jobs and more usable goods and services for the real people in this country. Seymour Melman is correct. We do have a permanent war economy, but we don't have to keep it that way. We can change. We have to begin to plan. We have to convince the public that this is a good idea and that it's doable. We've got to do our legwork, our groundwork. We have to allay the fears that it would hurt and show people how much better it would be. Thomas Jefferson said, "The care of human life and happiness and not their destruction is the first and only legitimate object of good government." And I'm strongly inclined to agree with Thomas Jefferson. So thank you for watching the program. We invite you to find more information about peace, social justice, and nonviolence with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 360-491-9093 and www.olympiafor.org. Thanks. Appreciate your attention and whatever you can do. We're all one human family. We all share one planet. We can make the world a better place, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs what you have to offer. Thanks.